that you have a sense of the heart and the blood vessels, now we're going to take a closer look at blood itself. And it's actually covered in Chapter 6 in your textbook, so you can refer to Chapter 6 as we work together through some diagrams of blood cells. These are actually photomicrographs, so you're actually looking at real blood cells. And again, there are numerous websites that are going to show you normal and abnormal blood smears. So when you think of blood, again, thinking of the cardiovascular system functions, blood is delivering oxygen and nutrients to your individual cells, nutrients like glucose and other lipids and proteins and things, and it's going to pick up waste products, things that the cell has produced like CO2 and cumulatively things like urea and uric acid that your cells are going to be forming. And we want to make sure that we recognize the blood cells. There are three major types of blood cells. You might remember that blood is a connective tissue. It has the living cells and then the non-living matrix that's mostly water. So if we were to take a blood sample, if you've ever given blood, if you've ever given blood, you see that whole blood sample and it looks red to your eye. If you were able to spin that, centrifuge that sample, you'd find that just over half, about 55% of that, is actually plasma. Plasma is the clear fluid that those cells are suspended in. And that plasma is mostly water, but it's also some proteins, things like immunoglobulins, which we'll talk about when we get to the immune system, and various other carbohydrates and things, and then the cells themselves. And so today what we want to look at are the major cells, or formed elements, as they're sometimes called, of the blood. So the one that you'd see most, the one that you would expect to see most, is what we call the red blood cells, or erythrocytes. And those are by far the most numerous, and that's what gives your blood that red appearance. Remember that those red blood cells look more red when they're carrying oxygen. If we were able to look inside them, which we can't really see with a light microscope, we'd find that there's hemoglobin. And hemoglobin is going to bind oxygen. Quite a lot of oxygen is carried by your red blood cells. So your red blood cells' main job is to carry oxygen. To a lesser extent, they carry CO2. But if we were to look at just the red blood cells, the second cell that you might find, and it's actually the least numerous, but it's the one they're emphasizing on this picture, are the white blood cells. They're called white blood cells because they do have more of a transparent appearance or clear appearance. In this diagram and in your textbook, they've been stained. The pictures and diagrams have been stained so that you can really visualize those white blood cells. The white blood cells are fighting invaders in your body, fighting infection. So you may have heard of things like leukemia, and those white blood cells are called leukocytes. Leukemia would be a situation where those white blood cells are increasing in number to try to fight an infection. So there are many, many disorders, and when we get to the immune system, we can think of some of those specific white blood cell disorders. But let me just run you through the 5 white blood cells so that you have a sense of those. And I always remember the saying, never let monkeys eat bananas. Never let monkeys eat bananas. Because there are neutrophils, lymphocytes, monocytes, eosinophils, and basophils. So you have to remember what those really stand for. But the neutrophils are the most common. In fact, that little saying is in the order of most numerous to least numerous white blood cells. Remember, collectively they're called leukocytes. However, the neutrophils, their main job is going to be to phagocytose. They're going to engulf and digest invaders. You notice that they have a really unusual nucleus. Their nucleus is called a multi-lobed nucleus. And you may have noticed that the red blood cells didn't have a nucleus at all. In fact, because they're so busy carrying oxygen, they lose their nucleus. But the white blood cells do have a nucleus. They do tend to survive a little bit longer than those red blood cells. Neutrophils are phagocytosing, or engulfing and digesting invaders. The next most common one is called the lymphocyte, and people get that mixed up a little bit. So collectively leukocytes, but specifically the lymphocytes. You might notice that they're a little bit smaller than the other white blood cells. And lymphocytes are found in your lymph, in places like your lymph nodes, your spleen, your tonsils, and your other lymphatic organs. And their job is going to be activated to become B and T cells. So we'll talk more about those in a later chapter. But think of them in the lymphatic system as well as the bloodstream, fighting infection. The next most numerous would be the monocytes. Monocytes have a somewhat U-shaped nucleus. You notice it's not a perfect U, and sometimes it's not a U at all. but that's kind of the generalization compared to the multi-lobed neutrophils. Monocytes' job is to also phagocytose. They become macrophages when they get out into the tissues. So monocytes and macrophages you would associate together. The fourth one, the eosinophils, the diagram here doesn't really give you the best picture, but they're responding to a dye called eosin that's a very bright fuchsia color. And in your textbook on page 117, you'll see that those little granules in the cytoplasm are bright, bright pink. These are going to respond to parasitic worm infections. So allergies and parasitic worm infections, if you've been traveling and you're having some sort of unusual symptoms, your doctor may perform a blood cell count and look for eosinophils and see if they're elevated in their numbers. And if they are, he or she might suspect a worm infection, along with your symptoms, of course. And then the last one, so the least numerous white blood cell are the basophils. These guys are packed with histamine. So they're really important in allergies, and they respond during an inflammation response. They're really recognizable because they have these numerous granules filled with histamine. So if we were to look at the numbers, and if we just think of leukocytes, just for your information, neutrophils make up more than half of all neutrophils make up more than half of those white blood cells, between 55 and 70%. The eosinophils, only about 1 to 4%. So remember, they were the next to the lowest number. The basophils, only 1%, or even less than 1% of the total white blood cells. The lymphocytes, about 20 to 30%, and the monocytes, about 2 to 8%. So again, the idea there of that never let monkeys eat bananas is most numerous to least numerous, and the white blood cells are going to fight infection. They're not carrying oxygen and that sort of thing to your body cells. Okay, erythrocytes were the red blood cells, leukocytes are the white blood cells. The third cell type that is actually a cell fragment are the platelets, or the fancy name is the thrombocytes. You kind of only see them as little fragments in the background. Here's an example of the platelets where they're really highlighted. The platelets are actually a cell that has burst, and the platelets' job is clotting. So they're going to fill openings in your blood vessels, and they're going to pack together. There are a number of signals that would cause them to stick to each other and stick to the wall of damaged tissue, so that they'll fill the plug or plug the hole, whatever way you want to think about it. So most numerous, the red blood cells. Then actually second most numerous would be the platelets, but they're so tiny that you don't see those as easily. And then collectively the white blood cells, and we mentioned the order in which they would be found. So your job is to start to learn those blood cells, try to recognize those, and on the lab quiz component I'll have some diagrams and ask you to label those for this week's lab quiz, the blood cells.